Hello to you, my cozy koalas. Have you ever wondered why Jesus opened a can of whoop ass on a bunch of dudes in the temple? Well, I'm going to tell you more about that here on Bible History with me, Bear. Alright, so let's get started on the story of the cleansing of the temple. Now, this is part of the Holy Week story. Interestingly enough, however, John places this at the start of Jesus' ministry. However, the Synoptic Gospels all agree that this happens in Holy Week. So Jesus has entered Jerusalem. Palm Sunday, people waving palms, they're shouting Hosanna, they're doing all of that. Jesus is already causing a bit of a stir with that. He gets questioned about this when he goes to the temple. And Jesus looks around at the temple and he gets himself a bunch of cords and puts them together and decides to make himself up a whip because he's crazy like that. So he gets his whip and then he goes and starts chasing out the money changers and those selling doves. Now, there's some mention of those who are selling other offerings, but there is always the mention of money changers and doves. Why is this important? All right, so there's a number of ways you can interpret the cleansing of the temple in regards to prophecy of the destruction of the temple, uh, allusions to previous cleansings of the temple in order to reform religious beliefs. But what I want to focus on today is this element of what it meant for money changers and those selling doves. Right? So one thing that is often missed when we're talking about this is some of these historical elements. So one thing to bear in mind is that at this time, and in fact throughout most of the temple history, you could not use outside money in order to pay your temple tax or to buy and sell in the temple. You could not use normal money. And there was a reason for this. Most money minted by the Greeks, the Romans, even the Persians contained images of their gods, or in the sense of Rome, images of Caesar. Caesar himself presenting himself as a god. We get an image of this when Jesus is asked about paying taxes and he takes a coin and says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's." Caesar's face was on the coin, give to him that one. And it makes a bit more sense in the sense that you couldn't give that in the temple, right? You couldn't pay your temple taxes and you could not buy with that in the temple. They had their own coin. You could either use a Tyrian coin or you could use a shekel. So, everyone over the age of 20, any male over the age of 20, had to pay half shekel in temple tax every year to the temple. And in order to do this, you had to change your money. If you wanted to buy an offering to give to the temple, whether this is an offering or this is a sin offering or whatever, to reconcile yourself with God after having sinned or gone through some sort of life process, remembering that women who gave birth had to offer a dove or another offering in order to cleanse themselves, in order to be allowed back into the temple, to be back into God's community. So this is a huge part of that religious belief. In order to make yourself right with God, there are a list of things you need to do. And among those are giving offerings in the temple. Now, in the Torah, we see that there are different levels that you can give, right? And it makes it clear that you give based on what you can afford, right? So if you can afford the ox, you give the ox. If you can't, then the sheep. Then it's this, and then it goes down to doves, right? Doves are your lowest form. You can't give anything else. If you're poor and that's that's what you can afford, right? That's the lowest level. So doves is for the poor, right? Doves is for the offering of the poor. So what we see is a real focus on the way those who are marginalized in the community, those who are at the poorest, are being taken advantage of. There is other records from the period that suggest that the temple was also taking advantage of the poor. One of the first instances of what happens when the temple is taken over by rebels during the First Jewish War is that they burn all of the debt records. So the temple would loan out money to people who were poor, who were impoverished, who had fallen on hard times. And they would keep a record of all of those debts. The first thing that the rebels do is to burn those records, to wipe out everybody's debt to the temple. There were some ideas at this time that said that if that you wouldn't have as much corruption of priests if they're all rich. Like if they're all rich, then they don't need the money, right? But how are they getting rich? Is not the question was asked. It was just, well, if they're rich, they don't need the money. So they can't be corrupt because they don't need the money. But if they're acting corruptly to get the money, then that is itself a problem. But that's basically what we're seeing happen here. So when you hear people talking in churches and going, well, you can't have any sort of commerce in a church, I don't think that that's what this is talking about. Certainly, Jesus didn't say you can't have any commerce, but I think there is a clear difference between, say, selling coffees or whatever, and saying, oh, in order to participate in this church service, you must give X amount of dollars, right? That is different, right? And equally, I think we would have differing ideas if, for example, a church said, oh, you can only give using our God coin or whatever, right? If they came up with a crypto and said, okay, you can only pay in this, right? And then you had to buy that crypto in order to pay your tithes or to give any sort of offerings or to participate in any aspect of that church service. If that was a requirement, I think we could legitimately say that this is what Jesus was talking about. It's why it's sort of somewhat removed from our own society because we can just use our own money to pay for things. We're not required to convert our money before we can come to God and do things. So whilst there is that element of some commerce, particularly when that commerce takes advantage of people, that should not have a place in our churches. Absolutely. You know, I think one of the things that turns a lot of people off from churches is this idea of people taking advantage of the poor or the vulnerable, going, oh, if you just give X amount of dollars, it'll come back to you tenfold. Now, there is some biblical verses that could back that up, but it is not by any means a guarantee. And taking advantage of people who are in that vulnerable position can be problematic. Equally saying, if you give $1,000, God will cure you of your cancer. That is also taking advantage of people who are in a vulnerable position. So I would definitely say that you could use this to talk about these elements in some modern churches, amongst some preachers and teachers who do these things. I think that is a general argument. I don't know that we can quite take it to, hey, we, charge $2 for a coffee in order to just make the money, because it costs us money to get the coffee and things like that. I think that that's a different element to this story. But certainly what we are seeing Jesus doing here is foreshadowing the destruction of the temple that would come 40 years later, but also talking about the disadvantaged, the poor in our community, and the way that even amongst the religious groups of the time, they were taken advantage of. So I think that that's what we get from this story. It's what you should take account of. So if we're going back just over what we've just said, you had to change your money in order to participate in any sort of religious function in the temple. You were expected to pay a temple tax. Every man over 20 had to pay a temple tax every year to the temple. That was for the running of the temple and the like. Thirdly, we have a focus on the elements of the religious requirements that were targeted to the poor, that were the level to which the poor participated. And that is where we see a target by Jesus. So I think it is very clear that we can look at this and see an element of this that is in fact targeting the taking advantage of poor people, those who are in need in our society. So there you have it. Follow along. We're going to do some more about Holy Week coming up this week, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Bye bye.